The issue of ego and growth mindset is really important in martial arts because there's loads of bad training partners that don't get their ego out of the way, that do treat everything as a threat, and they're bloody dangerous, frankly, and they don't learn very much. The ones who advance the quickest approach it in a playful manner, where the mistake is part of the learning process, where I'm willing to lose in order to learn. Whereas if you approach things with a fixed mindset, every time you practice, you're just surviving. If one person's surviving, what's the other person doing? Not the best way to learn.
So today we're talking about the concept of growth mindset and its application in coaching. Growth mindset is the idea offered up by Dr. Carol Dweck that suggests that our abilities and our intelligence are developed and improved through dedication, hard work, and learning from our mistakes. Basically, this means embracing challenges and seeing them as opportunities for growth. And people with a growth mindset believe that effort and perseverance are essential for success. On the other hand, a fixed mindset is the belief that our qualities and talents are set in stone, and we have a predetermined level of intelligence and ability. Those with a fixed mindset tend to avoid challenges because they fear failure and believe that effort won't make a difference. They may also feel threatened by the success of others because it implies that they are not as capable. Really, a growth mindset encourages a love of learning, resilience, and a belief in personal development, while a fixed mindset limits our potential by assuming that our abilities are fixed and unchangeable. This means adopting a growth mindset can lead to greater success, happiness, and fulfillment in various aspects of our lives. So to help us unpack this in the context of coaching, I've invited a colleague of mine, Dr. Joseph Hall, to share how he uses this with the coaches that he works with in his role as Director of Football and Men's First 11 team coach at East Coast Bays AFC in Auckland, New Zealand. Now, the cool thing about having Joe on the show is that he is not a Kendo practitioner. Joe does do jiu-jitsu, but his main sport of choice is football. But remember, we don't coach sport, we coach people. So there's plenty to learn from coaches from all areas. Now, this is especially true with Joe, given that his PhD looked at applying neuropsychology to sport coaching. So without further delay, sit back and enjoy the interview. And don't forget to leave a comment below on how you use a growth mindset to improve your coaching and also the experience of the people that you work with. You work with football coaches, right? So that's your that's your bread and butter, so to speak. When you're working with football coaches, what are the pain points that they tend to have? Like, where do you end up having to spend a lot of your time working with the coaches that you do?
I think the first thing is the novice coaches that too focused on the things they can't control, and they don't have the tools to be flexible, to adapt to changes in things that they don't control. So for example, a novice coach will speak to me about, I've designed something for this situation, these particular players, for exactly 16 players in my session. And then the session rolls around and it's 13, not 16. 3 of the people they wanted to work with in particular aren't there. And maybe the weather conditions are so good. And that's where the novice coaches will start to tell you, oh, it's too wet for me to do that. Oh, so-and-so isn't here. I can only run it with 16, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas the really advanced coaches you work with, there's always something. Like, even if you work at a high level, you'll have a plan, and then the physio or doctor won't clear someone just before the session. And then part of that as well is time. So novice coaches also think, oh, I don't have the time to plan my stuff fully like a more advanced coach would. More advanced coaches don't have more time, they're just better with it. Like, the reason they're more qualified or more experienced or whatever is they can do far more in 10 minutes than a novice coach can. So I would say when educating coaches, that's one of the first things is giving them a set of tools that will allow them to effectively teach no matter the external conditions. I guess in an individual sport, people come in from work or other things in their life. It's easy to work with a happy athlete that's ready to learn. Not so easy to work with an unhappy athlete that's just after outcomes all the time and trying to put them in a learning mode when all they'll do is execute. So, it's a different challenge, but the same principle. You can't control the mood the athlete walks in the door in, but what you can control is how they respond in your environment.
So what do you notice when you work with your more advanced football coaches? What is it in their skill set that allows them to utilize those emotions better and get something out of people, regardless of whether they've had a really rough day?
So So the first thing is role modeling. So if you want your athletes to come in a mindset where they're ready to learn, ready to experiment, ready to try their best, then you need to show that. And that might mean doing things that can fail. Like you might run an exercise or make a situation that's not really getting what you want, but actually taking the risk and not just running any old safe thing that people have known for 20 years. You're role modeling to the athlete that is like, it's okay to reach for something. So, and that can come into body language, how you greet people, how you move them from the rest of the day into the training, how you affect their perception of what's going on. And sometimes that can be helping someone unpack a bit. How's your day? Just having a normal conversation and kind of forcing a normal conversation on someone who doesn't want it and getting them to open. But then it might be how you treat the team. It might be cutting the tension with a joke. I think it's, in my practice, it's really important to get the athletes to be really good at switching completely off and then switching completely on. So like managing the tone from joking to pretty serious, back to joking again, back to pretty serious, and getting into a rhythm with that can help them get past it. So that's the first thing, role modeling. And then it's making sure that the practice is like planned with contingency. So if I plan an exercise for a certain number of players, I'm actually planning for plus or minus 2 to 3 on each side. So if we end up with more, which is the least likely one, I can handle it. If we end up with less, I can handle it. The hard thing is that the ability to do that in the moment is built up through it going wrong over many years. So you've had, like the players, more chances to make mistakes as a coach, to fix things, to attempt to fix things and not actually fix them, to attempt to fix things, make them worse. And then you start to figure out a way of handling that. So I think the hard part for some of this is that, like a lot of coaching, there's no shortcut other than being in the fire. Like it's just, reps really. And then I think for coaches, like maybe that's the more helpful mindset. Like every time the external factors go wrong, you view that as an opportunity to gain something as a coach, which is actually what you're asking the athlete to do. Even though you're unhappy, let's get something out of this. Even though you feel tired, let's get something out of this. Because even getting like a millimeter out of a session 100 times a year is going to get you somewhere.
And this is what you were talking about, keeping things in your control. You can, if things go pear-shaped during a training, or you've tried an activity that didn't quite take off or didn't quite land, it's still an opportunity to learn from it, right? That is something that's in your control.
Yeah.
In order to take that away. And it's the sort of thing that we speak to our athletes about all the time. Oh, losing a competition or failing a grading or something like that. It's an opportunity. Why, what can we take away from it? I guess the same thing applies to you being a coach, right?
Yeah. I think, it's easy when you're an athlete to judge yourself based on outcome. Did I win or did I lose? Which is like the most simple way to analyze something. The main thing I work on in teams is, setting intent rather than value or values. Because people tend to set values and they can be a bit like washy or removed from action. Whereas I think if you set intent, what you're doing is saying, here's the mindset with which we're going to just approach things. And we're going to decide how we respond to mistakes or feedback or challenge. And one of the main things I would say in my own practice, I try and achieve is the message that if something goes bad, you have to respond to it in a way where you can look back and say, hey, that setback was necessary, that we needed that. And then if you do that 2 or 3 times with a group, they start to shift their response towards challenge. They start to welcome it because they see it as growth and they want to be tested. They want to find out how good they are rather than and that might mean losing, right? Because some people just like winning, they're not competitors. Competitors were reaching for the person that can beat them. And I think helping people to realize that challenge and external things going wrong are necessary is really helpful, but also to take full ownership. I think the pure thing about martial arts is if someone hits you with that stick, it's only one person's fault. Like it's a fairly controlled environment. The uncontrolled environment might be in your own head. In my sport, there's many more things that people try and blame, but you have to, almost to the point of being unrealistic, take full ownership for everything that happens and work on that basis. When I started coaching, I got put through a lot of work on communication, counseling technique, things like that. that I've practiced the whole time. Whereas more of the psychological approaches for performance are things I came across later. So I've got less runs on the board with that stuff. But I would say most of what I do consciously with groups of teams or players or even individuals is to do with growth mindset.
Okay, so give us a synopsis or a nutshell version of what is meant by growth mindset, and therefore why it's important for a coach.
With growth mindset, it's how you respond, to effort. Is it high effort or low effort you want to apply? What if there's a mistake? Are mistakes a threat, or are they a challenge? Are they good for learning, or are they bad for learning? Well, we know that mistakes are good for learning, and high effort is good to apply for learning. The next part is feedback. So is feedback helpful, or is feedback a threat? And we've all worked with athletes that don't want to change how they're doing something. It's not working. They're going to persevere with it anyway, because changing it is a threat to maybe their identity as an athlete. And they don't want to take feedback from you because who are you? But actually it really doesn't matter. Like, it's just another set of eyes and another perspective. And someone with a growth mindset is going to search for answers from wherever source they can find them. They'll obviously still have some kind of filter, but the filter's not the ego being in the way. The filter is actually the quality of the information and the basis of the information. And I talk to athletes a lot about focusing on messages, not messengers. So you can have someone who's an expert in a different domain, and that gives them some kind of currency or status, but they still have to present information in a logical, helpful way. Having a certain status or a history of doing certain things, like, for example, being a really good Kendo player, doesn't give you the right to give bad information in a poor way, conveyed clumsily. Whereas even maybe a novice Kendo player could see a certain technique and by accident explain something in a very helpful, concise, well-based manner, a rational way. Because really in all sport, you're looking for objectivity. And just because they're a novice doesn't mean all the information could be bad. Like, if I have a growth mindset, my job is to let that information come and then make a judgment, but not to dismiss or like blindly accept based on who the person is that's speaking to me.
So this requires having a growth mindset in order to pick up the messages, regardless of where they come from, and make something from them, turn those into a learning opportunity, something to sharpen your performance. Regardless of where it comes from, we're looking at the information with an attitude that it could potentially really change it for us. So if I was a coach, a Kendo coach, listening to you sort of explain this now, I'm thinking, yeah, I love that idea, but how do I go about creating a growth mindset with my students, with my athletes? What do I do? What are the first steps? How do you create a culture that allows this growth mindset to come through at every level of the dojo?
Well, I think the first thing is you have to create psychological safety in the environment. So we want high effort, but failure is okay. In order to create safety, you need to create trust. The best way to create trust, I think, is with vulnerability. So building relationships with the athletes where you're comfortable to share maybe things you're not perfect at, but show that you're willing to reach. Giving them challenges where they can't achieve them, and then making that okay. Taking people to an edge where maybe they do feel a bit at threat with the difficulty of the task, and then helping them manage that. And I think the issue of ego and growth mindset is really important in martial arts, because there's loads of bad training partners that don't get their ego out of the way, that do treat everything as a threat, and they're bloody dangerous, frankly, and they don't learn very much. Whereas the ones who advance the quickest approach it in a playful manner, where the mistake is part of the learning process, where I'm willing to lose, and it's okay to lose in order to learn. So I get my ego out of the way. So actually what I do is I'm more attentive to what's going on. So to be honest, I think the applied part for something like Kendo is helping athletes to use a growth mindset to pay more attention to their sparring, for example, and to understand the amount of weight, force, effort that's going into something in order to get feedback. So how much resistance does there need to be for me to find out what I need to find out about this movement or that strategy or that tactic? Whereas if you approach things with a fixed mindset, every time you practice, you're just surviving. Like, there's no, and if you're if one person's surviving, what's the other person doing? Yeah, it's not the best way to learn. So that would be how I'd approach it. Like, show some vulnerability as a coach, get your highest ranking members to show vulnerability through even giving them challenges they can't quite handle, but then supporting them through that. And really, like, if you were to sum this up, what you want is a high challenge, high support environment. So every time someone does fail, you're right there, and you're right there with opportunities for feedback and two-way feedback as well. So basically what you're saying is, if you fail, I'll coach you even better. Like, the more you reach, the more I'll be there, and I'm not going anywhere. Whereas the easy thing is, like, someone fails, coach gets a bit pissed off because they want to win. They don't talk about it, and then it becomes all outcome based. Like, that was bad because you lost. Well, I mean, Kendo is a one-on-one sport, so half of everyone's losing. So it can't be enough to only learn when you win. And I would assume at the beginning you don't win very much. It's going to be pretty high challenge, and you need to pay attention to the things that are stopping you from progressing.
Can you just explain briefly what you mean by two-way feedback?
Yeah. So, well, the opposite of two-way feedback could be one-way feedback, right? Which would be the coach telling the athlete what they saw, or the opposite would be the athlete telling the coach what they felt, and then nothing else happens. Whereas really we want both perspectives. So two-way feedback is about saying, you start with either the coach or the athlete. I would lean towards starting with the athlete, because I want to know what they perceived before they decided to do something. And then based on what they decided, how did they execute it, and what was the consequence? And if I know what they intended to do, it's easier for me to work through that chain. So if I know that they saw a certain movement, like I'd be looking at like the movement of the opponent's elbow or something, and therefore I decided to attack it a certain way, but then I just couldn't quite get the technique right, then the feedback from the coach should be based on the technique. If I don't ask the athlete what they intended, I'm just kind of throwing shit at a wall and hoping it sticks. Yeah. And if they know that they're not going to get an opportunity to come back to me, then they're either taking it in or it's bouncing off the dome and they're going, yeah, I'm not interested in this. So two-way feedback being coach to athlete or athlete to coach and vice versa at the same time. What did you intend to do there? How did it feel? What did you think of the way you executed it? Here's what I saw. How do you think you could change this? And then, they start to work through the movement themselves. And the hard part with feedback is like zooming it out to something simple, to a simple cue at the end, because what you're trying to teach is movement. And teaching movement is easier when you can give one cue that groups a bunch of movements together, rather than coaching, how to move the finger, the wrist, the elbow. That's not going to work under pressure. So I think that's the hard bit, is like the two-way feedback, then zooming out to something simple and actionable, kind of, so they can put that bit of feedback in their toolbox, so to speak.
I did a video the other day about exactly this, giving feedback through analogies, so that these things could be easily sort of digested in a quick and personally relevant way. If I've found in the past, giving feedback in those ways, it sort of creates a little bond between you and the athlete that you're working with, because that analogy becomes relevant to them and what they're working on, rather than a generic one for everyone in the room. Building growth mindset basically requires a little bit of trust, and to build that trust requires a bit of vulnerability. And it's important that we close the loop with feedback wherever we can, right? And you're saying that it's important that we need to get feedback from the coach, obviously, from that point of view, but also the coach checking in with the athlete. What were they intending to do? And how can we leverage that for feedback that leads to better learning and better performance, right?
You want to be as inclusive as possible, right? Because I think for a lot of sports, coaches, there's some outstanding coaches in the world that just haven't had the right person walk in the gym, but the talent that you want to walk in the gym might just be the most difficult person you come across. And because of how you see the world, you think it's negative when it's not really. You have to approach this yourself as a coach with a growth mindset, because you're bound to come across someone with a story, a background, behaviors that challenge what you think are appropriate or what you think are helpful based on your own values. If you approach that with a fixed mindset, you'll see that difference as a threat. If you approach it with a growth mindset, you'll see that difference as a challenge. And then you're more likely to navigate that difficulty. The thing is, when you have a long-term view, the dips are very small and the highs are pretty small. And if you go through massive lows and massive highs, then things are going to get pretty hard to sustain. People just get, emotionally, mentally burnt out. So if I can keep a long perspective and keep the dips smaller and the highs lower, I'll get more consistent performance and more sustained energy. And the way to do that is to zoom out with perspective, to keep people with a long-term view so that they feel as though, oh, actually, today wasn't the end of the world. Today was just, I got challenged. And then they have the opportunity to respond to that challenge and get better. The way I try and achieve that with players, and I think about youth players we work with, is to say, we're going to make a 5-6 year commitment to you. I don't care what you can do now. I care what you can do in a year. And we'll work with you until you can achieve something here, or you're good enough to achieve something somewhere else, whichever comes first and whichever fits your preference first. But, we'll work with you until it's not the right thing anymore. And I think that relaxes people.
I love what you just said about, I don't care what you can do now. I care what you can do in a year from now, and 2 years from now, 3 years from now.
Yeah.
Obviously, you're working with coaches and athletes that are in a slightly more advanced, shall we say, stage of their careers. And what I mean by that is that they're able to play. They're being selected for a particular team within a bigger club. Would that approach work just as well for beginners, first time, couple of weeks on the floor, sort of trying to build an attitude or a culture right from day one, saying, look, we're not here to nitpick on a day-to-day basis. We're looking at the progress you can make over a year, and whatever ups and downs we experience, those are all opportunities for growth and learning.
100%. I think the hardest thing for a beginner when you do something is your ego tells you that you should be good at everything you try. I grew up with people that, I tried this, but I wasn't very good at it, so I quit. And I'm like, you did it for, I didn't think like this at the time, but now I look back and go like, you did it for 2 days. Like, how were you going to be good? So everything takes time. And in sport, it takes if you think about the growth from being a child to an adult, there's a lot of changes in how you have to move your body, how you have to interact with others. Brain development takes place during that time. And I think introducing a lot of time pressure to get an outcome into that mess is not a great way to work. So for beginners, the biggest achievement is show up with a good intent. And I really couldn't care less how rubbish you are. Because in a year, if we practice the right way, you won't be as rubbish.
Right.
Yeah, maybe that's the funny way to look at it is to say, hey, you'll be less rubbish next year. Like, it's the humorous way. I do see it in martial arts, guys that come in the gym and you can sense in the way they practice that everything's maybe not on purpose about, fear of losing, but like their actions are very much tension driven, anxiety driven, more about surviving or winning or not losing than learning. And maybe it's because they're really good at a bunch of other stuff. I think in martial arts, a lot of people pick them up later in their life for lifestyle reasons. If you're a master in another field, to go back to square one in a different field is quite hard. And to be always on show for that as well. Because the thing about sport, like the beauty of it is the truth's on the pitch or the truth's in the gym. Like whatever you're doing is the truth of where you are. But that can be uncomfortable if that truth isn't very good yet. So yeah, I think it's helpful to say, I just couldn't give a shit how good you are now. I care what you can do in a year. And actually, to be honest, the better the athlete, the more you owe that to them, because they're more likely to be reaching for something. So if you come in with someone who's like top 10 in the world, they're trying to go top 2, you better come in with not caring how they got to top 10 and only caring about how they get to top 2. Because if you give too much credit to what they've done in the past, you still want to give some out of respect, but you're going to be more hesitant to help them, I think. I think the most respect you can give there is to come with high challenge. I think it's universal, this idea of just long-term view to developing people.
I don't care how, well, yeah. So I get what you're saying. I do care how you got here, but what's more important is how we're going to take you to the next.
Yeah.
You say reach, how we're going to reach to the next goal, the next ambition.
Yeah.
Depends
100%.
on this growth mindset that you've got or that you can bet in. Great idea. How do I do it? When do I do it?
So two-way feedback and reframing would be the applied tools for the coaches in making this happen. Understanding the athlete's perspective, giving your own knowledge, and then seeking high challenge, but helping them handle that through reframing and stopping them going into a threat state when they're challenged highly. And what reframing does is it allows you to notice when you're seeing something as a threat, to recognize the effect that has on your body and how you're thinking, and then to consciously go, okay, this is a threat, but I want to learn from this. I'm going to see this as a challenge and start to work on the steps to solve it. And then the other thing is like, this is a threat. Am I going to defend myself, or am I going to use this as an opportunity for discovery and be more playful? And if you can get people to catch themselves going into a threat state and start to just shift and let that thought go and start to pay more attention to discovery and challenge, over time they get quicker at that basically and develop effective routines, normally through breathing or something that help them get through that. And I think that really helps martial arts, because every time you make an action, you tend to exhale. So breathing is a part of the art. And I think that makes it easier for athletes in martial arts to access that kind of technique with reframing.
How do we create these scenarios where we put a little bit of pressure, controlled pressure or stress on the athlete so that they can practice things like their breathing or responding and reframing so that they can continue to learn and grow?
Well, I think you have to define where the pressure in your sport comes from. I think it's always outcome pressure. Is it time pressure? Is it what I would call mismatch pressure, where, hey, I'm pretty good, but the way this person does things is like the rock to my scissors type situation. And I think you can, in a fun way, you can put things on the line. So, like a small consequence for the loser, a certain amount of time, maybe a certain deficit, a points up, points down situation. And then to also introduce fatigue. And for me, fatigue is the best one, which you have to be careful with, because that's where you really play with fire around injury and emotion. When you're fatigued, there's less, conscious control of your emotions, basically. So you see people get frustrated more. So if I introduce fatigue with some competition pressure, some time pressure, and maybe like, an uncomfortable pressure of always being in a bad spot. I don't know what a bad spot would be in Kendo, but like if it was in football, it would be, we're trapped in our own penalty box for 15 minutes and we've got like a slim lead or even a deficit. And if we don't get this deficit, there's a consequence on the table or something. The easy one in martial arts, like if I think about jiu-jitsu, is having someone just start from my back. So in the worst possible position all the time, with me getting progressively tireder. And then if you really want to do it, like you could, and we do this in football as well, as like shark tanking, where the fatigue pressure is turned up because it's always against a fresh opponent. So every 5 minutes, swapping in someone fresh for the same situation and the same scenario, and you're getting, the athlete under threat is like getting tireder, it's getting harder, they're still not succeeding, like they've got to learn to deal with all of that. The hard part of that kind of training, and you do see it in other sports, is maintaining the safety throughout. There has to be an off button, effectively. I wouldn't suggest doing this in like a dangerous way, like you're just trying to simulate the environment, but it has to be high challenge, high trust. Like if you look at big wave surfers, they'll do like underwater wrestling, where they're underwater against their will, but the instructor is very attentive to when they pull them out, and understanding the kind of challenge they're capable of achieving. Like if you can break down where the pressures come from in competition and introduce them into your environment, sometimes in a fun way, then you can try and simulate those moments and use them as part of your training.
I did a video the other day about modifying certain elements or certain parts of the scenario. You might be a couple of points down or you're a couple of points up, but that idea of introducing fatigue in order to add the extra pressure. If you're at the back end of a competition, you've got 30 seconds left on the clock and you're gassed, you're going to sink or swim there basically. So I think building in those nuanced constraints, right? Things that are going to be really applicable to the pressures that your athletes or your students are going to face when they're on the floor in a grading or in a competition or whatever. It makes those opportunities so much more realistic and so much more beneficial, rather than just going through the drills and then doing the sparring at the end. We're starting to be really purposeful on how we're building up people's learning and people's performance as a result.
And as a coach going, I don't care that I've coached 20 years or anything like that. I just care how I help the person today. And that might go wrong, but I'll navigate it. Like it's just a challenge. And I think if you start to come with that kind of thing, you're already role modeling what you're going to ask of the athlete. The sharp end of it is that it's two-way feedback. It's reframing in order to achieve a growth mindset with the athletes.